Begin the conference with Kelly McBride, the Vice President for Academic Programs at the Poynter Institute and head of the Ethics faculty. Kelly?
All right, so good morning. I've been here for 10 years, and probably for 10 years I have been working on figuring out how this new era that we have fully stepped into now in journalism is going to change the way we do ethics. Last year we talked about how I believe that with the digital changes in how the audience gets information and how the audience creates information and how we distribute information, that we're probably going to rethink how we articulate our ethical principles. Last year I published a book, and it argues that those three core principles that Bob originally articulated in the 1990s, seek the truth, report it as fully as possible, act independently, and minimize harm, that those three principles would transform themselves. Because in journalism, our ethics don't come from an ivory tower the way they do in medicine or in law or in even accounting. And that's because we're an unlicensed profession. Our ethics have always come from the audience and what the audience finds most useful as they consume information. And our ethics have always been tied closely to democracy. And that's because journalism, in its primary function, is meant to equip citizens with the information they need to carry out their democratic duties. So to the extent that the audience finds information useful and helpful, that becomes our ethical principles. And the classic example of that is as we went from a society where we had many voices, lots and lots of newspapers in the early 1900s in every community, to a society where we only had a few voices in every market through the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, one or two or three newspaper voices, and as television became a means of distributing journalism, 2 or 3 or 4 television stations in every community, transparency was not as important as independence. Independence at that point in time was what the audience found important, because accessing the means of distribution at that point in time were so difficult that they didn't necessarily want everybody to have a voice, but they wanted the voices that got through to the marketplace of ideas to be independent, to be neutral. But now we live in an environment where everybody can access the marketplace of ideas. A blog is as likely to get traction on any particular issue, a blog by an everyday average citizen, as the nightly news. That independence isn't as important to the audience anymore. But transparency is really important. So that's one example of how our ethics are changing because the audience is telling us that they want something different. Today we're talking about data and how data is transforming journalism. And I want to share with you 3 observations that I've noticed just very recently, and then talk about how I think those are going to transform our ethical ideas in journalism. So we're going to talk about speed, we're going to talk about the volume of storytelling that we have available to us, and we're going to talk about how algorithms affect our storytelling, and particularly how algorithms affect democracy. So real quick, let me just go through these 3 ideas. So speed. We all know that the world has gotten very fast when it comes to the production and distribution of journalism. Anybody who's working in the world of journalism knows that we create a lot more stories today, and those stories are distributed much more quickly than they ever have been in the history of mass communication. And we can look at the Boston Marathon or the shootings in Newtown, and we can all find examples of how journalists make mistakes because of that speed. And that's actually, I think, an easy problem to solve. I think the harder problem to solve is when we're not necessarily making mistakes, but we're doing things that cause harm because we're not even slowing down enough to ask what the harm is that we're causing. And here is, I think, the most recent example. When Robin Williams died, that story was the top story at almost every news site for a good 2 weeks. And part of telling that story, in order to get the audience, was figuring out a way to tell it in a poignant, meaningful way. And so we saw many journalists sharing, and many citizens as well, sharing this sentiment. And in fact, here's the original tweet, which came from the Academy: "Jeannie, you're free." And you can see 331,000 retweets, 239,000 favorites. Okay, this is a sentiment that was probably the dominant sentiment in the marketplace of ideas for at least a week. And the thing is that this is actually a harmful message to send. And we know it's a harmful message to send. There are more than 100 studies that document that when we glorify suicide and when we suggest that the person who killed himself is set free, that actually creates a contagion effect. It is scientifically proven, and we have really well-written documents that help all of us who are professional communicators communicate about suicide in a way that minimizes that contagion. And there are basically 3 really important things that we do in journalism to prevent suicide contagion. One is that we don't focus on the means of death, but we sure as heck did with Robin Williams. The other thing is we don't suggest that it is a simple cause of death, that is attributed to one thing, but we did with Robin Williams. And then the other thing is that we don't glorify or lionize the individual and treat him like a hero, because what that does is suggest to other people that suicide is a logical option. So there are these recommendations for reporting on suicide. They are really well written. And because of the speed with which we were communicating, we as an industry, and really it was beyond just the journalism world. It was almost everybody who has a platform. Sorry, I don't know why everybody who has a platform ignored the science that we have about suicide and instead created what is essentially a contagion effect. And I was just at a conference on covering suicide, and the researchers there are saying that they are already seeing that there was an uptick in the number of people who committed suicide in the wake of Robin Williams' death. So there isn't among scientists much of a doubt that there will be an uptick. There was certainly an uptick in the calls to crisis lines. That was a good outcome. But the fact that more people will have killed themselves as a result of the way that we communicated about Robin Williams has everything to do with the environment that we're in now and the fact that we don't slow down enough to ask about the harm that we're causing. So speed is certainly changing the way we consider what our ethical obligations are. In addition to that, the volume of information that we are creating has changed the way we tell stories. And here's a very specific example. In 1994 in Chicago, there were 930 murders. 930. This is a story about the July 4th weekend when 8 people were killed in 1994. And you can see what section of the paper it ran in, right? It ran on page 2, section 2 of the Chicago Tribune. This is one story that was told, and this was about a 11-year-old kid who was killed by his fellow gang members so that he wouldn't talk about another murder that he had been involved in. His name was Yemi Sandifer. But this was the exception in 1994. This was one murder that was covered, and maybe the newspaper did 15 or 20 murder stories in the entire year out of those 930. Maybe 15 or 20 of them were documented. And at the time, when you polled people in Chicago about their concerns about safety, they rated their concerns about public safety as relatively moderate. So last year, Chicago marked 500 homicides. It was actually 2012. And it got the title of the murder capital of the world for 500. Now think about that. 931 20 years ago, 500. Yet the perception of the crime in Chicago is much greater now. So these are classic stories that penetrate the marketplace of ideas. So this is from July of 2014, 82 shot, 14 fatally over the holiday weekend, 72 shot. This is NBC in Chicago. This is a USA Today story about violence. So what's changed? What changed in why we cover crime so much more now? Well, it's actually really easy to identify. What changed is suddenly a lot of people got into the business of telling the story of crime. It started with a really cool data-based program called ChicagoCrime.org. That was in 2005. In 2009, the Red Eye started something called the Homicide Tracker, where they would track every homicide. In 2011, Homicide Watch, which was originally started in DC, came to Chicago with its Mark Every Death, Remember Every Victim, Follow Every Case. Now, this isn't necessarily all bad or all good, but what you see happening in Chicago is, as citizens gained the means to document stories, they started documenting stories. The old system was not necessarily a good one, where you couldn't even find out if your neighbor was murdered, because essentially the inner city of Chicago was redlined in terms of coverage for crime. The newspapers and the television stations didn't spend a lot of time covering it because the audience for their product was not those citizens. That was not necessarily a superior system of journalism. But where we are now, we tell every story, yet we don't necessarily provide many solutions. And so we were in Chicago about 2 weeks ago doing a town hall meeting, and the citizens there were confused at best about whether the media actually serves their needs. They definitely feel better that the newspapers and the television stations tell the stories of the victims. But they also feel like they don't tell any other stories about their neighborhoods. Like journalists essentially parachute in, and so do bloggers, and yet we still don't know much about the neighborhoods where most of the crime happens. So, in 1994, there were 930 murders in Chicago. In 2012, there were 500, and yet today, while the journalism might be better in terms of volume, it doesn't necessarily help the citizens solve the problem. And I think that's the next step. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's definitely an issue that we're facing in journalism. And then finally, the issue of algorithms. This is another way that data is changing the way journalism and democracy work. So, algorithms control almost everything we see on the internet. And we are largely unaware. But algorithms control all the trending topics on Twitter. If KSU becomes a trending topic on Twitter, an algorithm will make that decision. When you see the top 10 stories on the New York Times, or when you see a list that determines what's hot on the web, that is an algorithm, which is essentially a formula, a complicated formula that was written by a computer programmer that draws that information to your attention, right? And we need algorithms because there's too much information out there. We don't manually sort through all the information. An algorithm determines what we see. So this particular cartoon is actually kind of funny because algorithms control our dating sites, and OkCupid is famous for this. But what's funny about this is there is no accountability for algorithms. There is no way as a citizen that you can hold an algorithm accountable right now. So why does this matter to democracy? Democracy is heavily dependent on this notion of the marketplace of ideas. That's in Athens, Greece, it was this physical place where everybody who was able to participate in democracy could share ideas, and the best ideas would rise to the surface. As newspapers and television stations became the dominant place where the marketplace of ideas was expressed, that was a flawed system too, because then we had a bunch of essentially white guys determining which ideas floated to the surface in the marketplace of ideas. But now the modern marketplace of ideas is controlled by an algorithm. And there are benefits to this. This story would have never seen the light of day before the internet. And that's because this woman who wrote a column about being a mother of a mentally ill child, she just wrote a blog post. And that blog post was then eventually picked up by Gawker and the Huffington Post and distributed widely. But it was because she started getting a lot of traffic to her blog post and it was trending, an algorithm determined that people were interested in this. So there are definitely benefits to an algorithm-driven marketplace of ideas, but there are also drawbacks. There are many, many websites now that have created a robot that will crawl all the sheriff's jails, draw in mugshots, and then charge you money to have that mugshot taken down. So the marketplace of ideas, people love mugshots, and people have figured out a way to exploit this and harm people by using public information. So the marketplace of ideas can, and here's Facebook as another example. Facebook, a lot of people think that they see everything on Facebook, but it is essentially an algorithm that determines what you see on Facebook. 62% of Facebook users are unaware that an algorithm controls what they see, and 26% think they might be seeing everything from their friends. So, how do we adapt transparency, the value of transparency, to answer this question of algorithms? Algorithms don't work if you totally tell people how they work, because then the audience can game the algorithm. We have to figure out a way in journalism to explain the bias of algorithms in a way that will allow them to work. But these are all ways in which data is changing our ethical values, and sometimes in ways that we're not even able to describe or articulate as an industry, as a profession. But they're things that we have to pay attention to. I think that you will see an evolution over the next couple of years, particularly around algorithms, but I don't think that we will. I don't think that the companies that currently control most of the algorithms that guide the marketplace of ideas have the same democratic values that journalism companies have. And so we have a lot of individuals doing journalism who don't necessarily embrace the values of journalism. We also have a lot of companies that are getting into the journalism space that aren't necessarily journalistic in their values. And the citizens will have to rise up and hold these companies accountable. So, questions? None? Okay.
You had said earlier there was a solution to the speed problem. Mm-hmm. What is that solution? And if it's so easy, why hasn't it been done yet?
So, one of the things that every web editor in the country faces right now is this demand to get more and more traffic. And there are some really tried and true ways to win the traffic war. And one of the tried and true ways is to, when something is trending, like Robin Williams' death, to get something up fast, and then very quickly to follow it with something that is unique or clever. So you win the first level, and then you win the second level. But increasingly, that race is becoming unwinnable, right? You're talking about a matter of seconds, and most web editors will be able to grow their traffic by 5 or 10% year over year or month over month with really easy fixes. But what we're learning is that that doesn't necessarily improve their revenue. And so as we figure out the revenue solution, which is largely around engagement, better journalism tends to produce better engagement. And so I do think that there'll be this natural correction to that workflow issue in most newsrooms where we'll still do the speed thing, but then the next thing that we'll do will be the better journalism thing, better storytelling. And I think as we bring more voices of citizens into the act of storytelling, which I know we're going to talk about throughout the day, as we bring more voices of citizens in, we'll start to find traction around more meaningful, deeper engagement rather than the quick and easy and simple or superficial engagement.
You have to hold it. Okay, hi.
And if you could tell us who you are, that would be great.
My name's Amni. I'm a senior electronic media production. Anyway, that's unnecessary. I feel like what you were talking about, there'd be the first post and then the unique piece. Wouldn't the first post just be distracting and most people would just see that as I got the point, and then that would be what people would run with? So wouldn't that be like an issue in itself?
So, you know, we measure by social media, right? Like how many people share this? How many people like it or favorite it on Twitter? And those tend to be the more clever, the second post. So the first one, Robin Williams is dead. Everybody wanted to share that. Everybody wanted to text it. And you can almost, if you think about a graph, you can see, like those first posts go out, and then there's like 100 times as many second level reports. And the second level reports came 30 to 60 minutes in where it was confirmed that he had committed suicide. Those are the ones that yeah, you're going to see a lot of engagement and traction around it. And that's where you saw the comments come under the stories, and you saw people start talking about it. That's the moment, I think, where when we get better at this, we'll seize that moment to do better journalism, not just faster journalism. But you're always going to have somebody whose model is built just on speed and volume. And that is essentially BuzzFeed, Huffington Post, the Daily Mail, You see a lot of those companies, and they're winning the revenue war right now. So there's a reward for that. But the rest of us are not going to win that revenue war because we're just not wired that way. So there will be, I think, another revenue model will reinforce that. But I don't think that's going to come in the next 6 months. You know, I think that there's a long strategy for that, and we still aren't really sure exactly what that revenue model will look like. I was just talking to some PhD students who are economists who are trying to describe a new revenue model for journalism that's not necessarily based on volume, but that's based on some other value proposition. And I kept pushing them to answer, like, what will that value proposition be? And they essentially said, well, we haven't finished our paper yet, we don't know. But I'm hoping that, like, by the time these guys get their PhDs, that they will know and that it'll be obvious. But, you know, I'm not gonna lie and pretend that I know what it will be. I just think that the audience itself is starting to become habituated to clickbait, and the audience will help find that revenue model. Any other questions?
Hi,
Hey.
my name is Caitlin. With all of the issues you're talking about right now, what do you think is the future of citizen journalism?
So I think that, so we've obviously seen, even just with social media, that citizens now have the ability to create and distribute journalism just like we do. And we have incorporated part of that into our model. We need them to share our work and to comment on our work. And sometimes we need them to contribute to our work. Like, we need to, before we actually have a product, we need them to give us something, whether it's a bunch of photos in a weather crisis or information about them so that we can describe more of the community to them. There's lots of ways that we are realizing suddenly that we need, as professionals, to have a very close relationship with citizens. But in addition to that, and especially like when I look at what's happening in Chicago, I think there are places where citizens are going to step in and usually with a nonprofit model be the dominant mode of storytelling. And that's because the audience for which they are telling stories is not going to be a valuable audience to advertisers. And so as long as we're based and the whole advertising model is really weird right now, like it doesn't actually work on the internet. But once they figure it out, like whether it's going to be native advertising or sponsored content or whatever the new advertising model is going to become, there are certain citizens for which journalism is not going to be a lucrative proposition. And so they're going to do journalism because they care about their communities. And one of the best examples of this is there's a community in Chicago called Englewood. It's one of the most violent communities in Chicago. And they have a really strong neighborhood association. And the acronym is RAGE. It's the Resident Association of Greater Englewood. They have their own community access television show. They have their own blog. They have a really vibrant website. And if you live in Englewood, you're not going to turn to the Chicago Tribune or to CBS or NBC. You're going to go to that website and those individuals and those Twitter feeds to get your news, because nobody else is giving you information that's relevant to your community. And so increasingly we're going to see that, and then the professionals are going to have to figure out how to build a bridge to those organizations. Like maybe they'll curate some of it, or maybe they'll figure out a way to do an advertising partnership around some of that content. But the business model is going to inform how the professional organization responds to the increasing volume of citizen content. But I do think citizen content is just going to grow and grow and grow. And some of it will rise to the surface as the most relevant around certain topics or certain issues. All right. Thank you very much. We're not taking a break.